We are talking today about the big history of language. And by big history, I just mean a big, huge overview of all of known time. What I want to talk about a lot is based on Walter Ong's 1982 book, Orality Literacy, the Technologizing of the Word. And by technology, we're really just talking about something that is invented by humans. And we also see that technology tends to be advanced and built upon, kind of like a remix of ideas. When we talk about orality and literacy, oral just refers to oral cultures with spoken languages. Before that, it's kind of debatable what the original development of language, how that happened or why. But at some point, through gestures and a kind of a sign language, along with sounds that are formed into words that people can use for communication, that's kind of the beginning of oral cultures. And that lasted for a really long time until we start getting into writing. But before we do that, let's start about 40,000 years ago. During this time period is when there's been a massive migration out of Africa down to Australia, where the Aborigines or the original first people are. And down there we find archaeological evidence that still exists of cave paintings and petroglyphs, which are rock carvings, rock engravings, things like that. And what you see mostly in these symbols is natural images of animals and of other naturally occurring objects. And so they're kind of using these natural forms as the basis, the kind of the grammar for their language, if you will. And this is an interesting development because they're not only just recording these, but they're using these in rituals of storytelling, of music, dance. All these things are kind of come together in their cultural activity, and it's kind of a way of them to record and experience their cosmology and pass down their stories. Then about 5,000 years ago, we get into early writing. You have the hieroglyphics in Egypt, and these are interesting because you still have these kind of this natural basis for the language. You see a lot of animals, but you also see a lot of animals and humans mixed together. What they've developed with these hieroglyphics that really separates it from just these, rock engravings is that they're what's known as logographs. And really this just means that they've developed a way to kind of very logically craft a story or a sentence that has a more or less one-to-one interpretation. But really this doesn't happen until the developments in the alphabet. You have this Proto-Canaanite language that through the Hebrew and the Aramaic gets translated into a Greek alphabet and a Roman alphabet, which is what we still use today in English. The interesting note here, still you have this writing that is tied up in this spirituality. Before the Greek, there were no such thing as vowels, and vowels are just a way of expressing intonations of breath, uninterrupted breath. And what you see in the Hebrew and surrounding region, their spirituality is that they're worshiping this invisible God who lives kind of in the breath or the wind of the earth. And so in the same way, you still kind of have this animalistic way of experiencing language. It's still related there. Their symbols still, you got oxes, the letter A, aleph, which is, the first part of the alphabet, aleph, beth. The first one, you've got this kind of, it's like an ox. And so you're still relating to real things, and then you're also relating to invisible things. So this is a way for language to transcend what we can see and what we can explain. But then you get into the Greek, and they decide that really you need these vowels in order, because there's kind of, which sound do you make in between the letters? And this makes it just easier to read and to write. And in the society that was Greece, that became pretty large as a cultural center, you see that they're able to kind of send out their culture through their alphabet. And here you can see this also kind of relates to their philosophy and spirituality of this kind of precision of logic. That's the way of finding truth, is through these kind of precise forms. And these become very abstract, just like their philosophy. No longer are these letters tied to real animals or real experiences. They are completely human-crafted symbols that only mean something to humans. That was about 3,000 years ago. About 2,000 years ago, you have the invention of the codex, a book binding. Before that, you just have all these big scrolls that people are carrying around. And before that, you have, these rock tablets that, Moses is coming down the mountains. And that was, there were only 2 tablets because I don't think that he could carry any more than that. And so they made scrolls because you can carry a few more. And then they made books because you can really store and send those around. And they're easier to deal with. They're easier to look things up. They're easier to read through. You don't want to read the first scroll and then the third one and then you find the second one. That just gets confusing. So this is a big development, and still during this time, though, this develops into this manuscript culture where you have all these scribes that are copying stuff and just a huge amount of information that's getting recorded down during this time. But it's still done through this kind of priesthood or these shamans or some kind of medium that is kind of this interpreter, the person that holds the knowledge for everyone else. And then 500 years ago, you get the invention of the printing press, and this sort of opens the floodgates of knowledge to the world, and it's kind of tied into the Reformation and Enlightenment and some of these post-Renaissance things where we see major fluctuations in world powers and ideas that have kind of led us up to the modern times. And that leads us to 150 years ago, the modern printing press and the typewriter, and kind of an even more accelerated version of getting writing out there. Then 115 years ago, we have 2 kind of huge simultaneous developments that really have brought us into what is called the post-literate age. Separately, you have silent film recording, photographic techniques that are turned into motion pictures, and you have early sound recording. It wasn't until about 90 years ago that they put these together in talkies. That's also when they had radio transmission. But this marks a huge development in the ability to record and transmit information. It's very much like orality in that it is mainly an experiential, heard thing. This is sounded words that you're listening to and things that you're seeing, just like you would experience when someone was talking to you directly. But it's also very much like literacy in the fact that it is recorded, it can be copied, it can be replayed, it can be rewinded, paused, fast forwarded. And this is kind of a new era of language. So about 70 years ago, you have video and television transmission, kind of the next step from radio and the next step from film technology. And then, of course, 40 years ago, you have kind of the next step in the printing press and the typewriter where you have computers and word processing and sort of we're really getting into the beginning of the electronic age at this time. 20 years ago, we have internet starting to really show up and social media beginning as kind of a web 1.0. And this marks another huge development where people are able, through writing, you're able to communicate across space and time. With oral cultures, you are kind of stuck. You have to be face to face with a person in order to say something to them, or maybe you can shout it across the room, but you have to be pretty well stationed in space close by. With writing, you're able to send these messages, through trade routes and stuff is what it really started as. But you couldn't have a conversation like you used to where you're face to face because you have to wait, maybe a month for some dude to travel to India and come back. But now with the internet, you can have an immediate conversation across space, or you can also choose to have a non-immediate conversation that goes on for a while, just like in writing. But you do have that option to communicate across space in real time, essentially, with maybe a small delay. And this is huge just in the fact that there are more people connected and more people conversing from different perspectives in the world. And I think that, we've seen some of the power structures begin to change recently. And I think they're very tied into these developments of electronic culture and the digital age. So 8 years ago, something major happened. Video sharing via YouTube became available. And so now we have all these really audio-visual perspectives from around the world, in addition to all the text that we're getting. So together, that really represents the post-literate age, this kind of post-literate language that is always grounded in this kind of oral sounded language, but also very much has the same usefulness of literate language. I mean, writing text on the computer is not that much different than writing it down in a book, although there are some differences in the process, and I think we see a little bit difference in the way that we think about creativity, the way that we think about creating. And that leads us to our last development. About 5 years ago, these so-called smartphones came out, and we have mobile web and mobile connectivity, and that really brings us into this virtual or augmented reality and kind of makes us cyborgs in the way that we kind of always have this device glued to us, either to our ear or to our hand or to our eyes. And so that's where we are.